Namaskar dosto and welcome back. Whenever you sit down to plan your next trip, do you ever stop and think that the whole concept of tourism is literally thousands of years old? It's a really fascinating journey that stretches all the way from the citizens of ancient Rome right up to today's modern Instagram traveler. So in today's explainer, we're going to unpack this incredible history. Okay, let's dive into this.
Right off the bat, I want to hook you with a question that might kind of challenge how you look at your next holiday. What is the actual difference between travel and tourism? I mean, humans have always traveled, right? Our ancestors moved around for hunting, for basic survival, for migration, but that is not tourism. Tourism, by definition, is travel that happens by choice. It's done for leisure. It only really begins when taking a trip stops being this desperate necessity for survival and starts being a voluntary, fun activity. So here is our historical roadmap for today. We'll start with the ancient roots of leisure, move through medieval travel and pilgrimage, explore the elite grand tour, witness the birth of mass tourism, and finally wrap up by comparing old versus new age tourism. Starting with part 1, the ancient roots of leisure, focusing on Egypt, Greece, and the Roman Empire, because the very first evidence of travel by choice actually comes from these ancient civilizations. The Greeks were actually early pioneers of spectator tourism. People would travel all the way to Olympia specifically just to watch the Olympic Games. We've even got the Greek historian Herodotus, who documented his trips around Asia Minor and the Black Sea, which pretty much makes him the world's first travel writer. Over in Rome, they built these massive, incredible road networks. And sure, they connected the empire for trade and the military, but wealthy Romans used them for leisure too. They traveled down to stunning coastal resort towns like Baia, near modern-day Naples, for their holidays. Honestly, it sounds incredibly modern, doesn't it? So, the crucial point is that this early form of tourism was strictly limited to the elite. The everyday commoner simply didn't have the money or the free time to just take a holiday. From day one, tourism was a heavily class-based privilege. Which brings us to part 2, medieval travel and pilgrimage, spanning the 5th to the 15th century. After the Roman Empire fell, those magnificent roads just decayed. Routes became unsafe, bandits were suddenly your new, unwanted travel buddies, and leisure travel almost completely vanished. And that brings us to this fascinating piece of linguistic trivia. The English word travel actually comes from the French word travail, which literally translates to pain, hardship, or as we say, cushed or dard. During the medieval period, hitting the road was literally a dangerous, painful task. Definitely not a vacation. But despite all that danger, two groups still kept moving: crusaders and pilgrims. People took on these highly purposeful journeys for their salvation. Pilgrims headed to Jerusalem, which is sacred to Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. They went to Rome for the Vatican, to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, and to Mecca for the Hajj. In England, they trekked to Canterbury to visit Thomas Becket's shrine. Actually, if you've ever read Geoffrey Chaucer's famous Canterbury Tales, drop a comment if you have, that whole classic piece of literature is based exactly on this pilgrimage route. And of course, you had the Crusaders traveling extensively on religious military expeditions. Now, this brilliantly highlights our next major takeaway. These pilgrimages didn't just offer spiritual growth. They accidentally built the exact infrastructure we use for modern travel. Because you had these large groups of people moving along specific routes, a whole new economy of inns, guest houses, and route maps sprang up. Historians actually view this organized group movement and accommodation boom as the true precursor to the modern tourism industry. Let's move to and see how this builds. Into part 3, the elite grand tour, covering the 14th to the 17th century. The Renaissance was a massive rebirth for art, science, and classical learning, and an absolute game changer for how humanity approached travel. The biggest development out of the Renaissance was this concept of the Grand Tour. Imagine an extended educational journey, sometimes lasting 2 to 3 years, taken mostly by young British aristocratic men. The idea was that your education just wasn't complete until you had personally soaked in the culture, art, and manners of Europe. It was basically the ultimate finishing school to become a complete gentleman. The route for this was pretty well established. An aristocratic traveler would usually kick things off in Paris to pick up the language and court manners. Then they'd brave the Alps to cross into Italy through Turin or Milan. Next stop was Florence to take in high Renaissance art at places like the Uffizi Gallery. Then heading down to Rome for classical antiquity, the ancient ruins, and the Vatican. Finally, they'd wrap the whole thing up in Venice, famous for its architecture and, let's be real, the leisurely carnival culture. So here's the catch, and it's absolutely crucial. History books love to call the Grand Tour the start of modern tourism, but we really need to view it critically. Yes, it gave travel an educational purpose, but it was still wildly exclusive, strictly limited to wealthy nobility. It also carried some very strong Eurocentric undertones, treating European high culture as just inherently superior to everything else. But structurally speaking, it was monumental. The Grand Tour literally birthed the concepts of travel guidebooks, collecting souvenirs, and creating that classic must-see bucket list. Those are the exact marketing foundations driving the tourism industry to this very day.
Okay, so travel evolved from survival to ancient elite leisure to painful medieval pilgrimage and then aristocratic education. That brings us to part 4, the birth of mass tourism in the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution. This is the exact moment tourism leaves the hands of the ultra-rich and becomes accessible to the common man.
To truly understand this shift, you've got to know the name Thomas Cook. On July 5, 1841, Cook organized a simple one-day rail excursion from Leicester to Loughborough for a temperance meeting, and he even included a little passenger handbook. That one small trip sparked an absolute empire. By 1855, he's organizing international package tours to Paris. By 1868, he's leading guided tours through the ancient ruins of Pompeii. Thomas Cook essentially invented the fixed-price, organized, and repeatable travel experience. But how exactly did he pull this off so fast? Well, it boils down to 2 massive shifts. First, the Industrial Revolution created a brand new middle class. Clerks, teachers, small business owners, people who suddenly had a bit of disposable income and leisure time. Second, technological breakthroughs in railways and steamships made transport remarkably cheap, fast, and accessible. For the very first time in human history, the middle class could actually afford to travel.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the double-edged sword this era presented. On one hand, you have the beautiful democratization of travel. A privilege that used to be strictly for kings and nobles was now available to everyday people. But on the flip side, this birthed the commodification of travel. We got fixed itineraries, a rigid checklist mentality, and entire destinations being redesigned strictly for tourist consumption. That dynamic right there is the direct root of the severe over-tourism we're seeing today in places like Venice or Machu Picchu.
Which leads us perfectly into our final analytical section, Part 5, Old versus New Age Tourism. Let's look at the transition from mass-produced trips to experiential travel, because we are currently living through another massive shift in how we approach our holidays.
If we put these 2 eras side by side, Old Age tourism, which dominated from the 1950s to the 80s, was built entirely on the 3S model: sun, sea, and sand. It was standardized, mass-produced, and totally focused on resting and checking sites off a list, mostly using big chain hotels. But New Age tourism, which really gained traction in the 1990s, is a total shift from quantity to quality. Today's travelers want personalized, experience-based trips. They're motivated by learning, immersion, and wellness. They care deeply about sustainability, they bypass traditional travel agents for apps and social media platforms, and most importantly, the modern tourist doesn't want to just be a spectator anymore. They want to be an active participant in the local culture.
A really fantastic example of this new age potential is the Kumon region in Uttarakhand. Over there, community-based homestay tourism is growing rapidly. When it's properly planned and completely community-owned, these models can genuinely empower the local economy and provide a deeply authentic experience for the traveler, all without harming those fragile hill ecosystems. So, to summarize our incredible journey today, we started way back in ancient times with elite leisure, transitioned to painful medieval pilgrimages, moved on to the education-driven aristocratic Grand Tour, witnessed Thomas Cook spark mass tourism in 1841, and finally arrived at today's shift toward experience-based, sustainable travel. The history of tourism is not just a list of destinations, it is a direct mirror of our society, our economy, and our shifting power structures over thousands of years. I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. We love to idealize New Age tourism, but it comes with its own major risks. If ecotourism isn't strictly regulated, it just becomes another marketing tool, a phenomenon known as greenwashing, where the label says sustainable, but the practice remains just as exploitative. So the next time you're booking that perfect getaway, ask yourself, is your trip truly sustainable, or is it just an illusion? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer today. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and I will see you next time.